Hello, my name is Rickard, and in this tutorial, I want to get you familiar with the Layers palette in Photoshop 2023. If you've used Photoshop at all, you know the importance of layers. And if you're brand new to Photoshop, what I want to do in this lesson is show you the Layers palette and show you the power of layers in creating composites in Photoshop. Now, if you want to follow along using the sample file that I'm using, you can download that in the link in the description of this video. So go ahead, do that, and then let's dive back into Photoshop 2023. Okay, so starting from where we left off, I want to revert this to the original. I'm going to go ahead and click on the Close File, little X here. We can also go to File, Close, or use a shortcut Command W to close our active document. Now, because we want to learn shortcuts, we're going to use Command W. So let's go ahead and do Command W. Now this will bring up our prompt here asking us if we want to save our changes. When this pops up, obviously if you're working on a project, you're always going to want to save it. However, because we don't want to save it, I can click on the Don't Save. Now, if I just hit Enter on my keyboard, it'll save. However, if I want to hit Don't Save, what I can do is do Command and then D for Don't, and it'll select that Don't Save without having to use my mouse. I'm a big stickler for using shortcuts as much as possible, so when you can, use a shortcut. All right, next we're going to go to open the same file again. Now I can go to File, Open Recent, and it'll be our sample file there. So there you go, and this is now reverted back to our earlier file. And what I want to do is introduce you to the Layers palette, get you familiar with the different types of layers, and also just generally how the Layers palette works. The Layers palette is the most important palette in Photoshop when it comes to compositing, and honestly, most things you do in Photoshop, your Layers palette is your most important palette. So you can think of the layer palette as a stack of images on top of each other, each one printed on a piece of transparent sheet. So if we go ahead and turn these eyeballs off, which controls whether you can or can't see those layers, you can see as I turn these on, these are elements that are stacking on top of our image. And where they sit in the Layers palette determines whether they're in front or behind those elements. So if I take this phonograph and put it underneath the Layers palette, you'll notice that the layers in our image comes on top of the phonograph. So it's very important the sequence of your layers in your layer stack. Whatever is on top will be on the top of this image, and whatever is at the bottom will be at the bottom of the image. So let's go ahead and turn all these layers back on. Now here at the top, we have our filtering. This allows you to filter by either name, effect, mode, or any of these other attributes. Now the first one is kind, and you can see the icons here show the various kinds of layers that exist in Photoshop. So the first and the most common is your pixel layer. Those are layers that have pixel information. Next, we have adjustment layers, and these are basically your image adjustments that you can access here, but as a layer rather than something that's done directly to your artwork or your pixels. Next, we have type layers. So here you can see the layers, and this is active type, meaning it's dynamic. You can change the text. Next, you have shape layers. So these are vector paths that have a color or a gradient or so forth. And then finally, you have smart objects. These are embedded layers, and we'll talk about those in a second. So I actually never use these filters. Maybe it's because I've never had a file big enough to need them in terms of amount of layers, but generally I don't use these. However, if you find it useful, obviously you can. All right, next we have the blending. Now blending is super important in Photoshop, so important that in the next lesson we're going to deep dive into it. But just know that this is where you set the blending mode of the layer that you have selected. And you can also select and adjust the opacity, meaning how transparent it is. So let's go ahead and select our layers here. And remember the auto select, if I hold down Command, I can select my layer. So here I've selected the layers, and here I can adjust how transparent my layer is. So here you can see that's at 50%. If I go back up to 100%, so I can click here and just drag the slider left and right, or you can just click on the word opacity and drag that left or right. You can also type in a number here, so 50. And another trick is when you have a layer selected and you're not on the brush tool or any of the tools that use a brush, so like the eraser tool or some of the other tools, when you click on a number on your keyboard, so 6, you'll notice that the opacity of the layer changes to 60%. If I hit 8, it changes to 80%. If I hit 2, it changes to 20%. If I hit two numbers really quickly in succession, so 5, 5, it'll change it to 55. If I hit 0, it'll change it back to 100, but if I hit 0, 0, it'll change it to 0. So that's another trick, another shortcut you should know is that you can change the opacity by simply hitting a number on your keyboard. All right, next we have the lock, and this allows you to lock aspects of your layer, or with the lock here, you can lock everything. So with it locked, you can't select the layer, you can't move it. So if I try to move this layer, it'll tell me that the layer is locked. Now this is useful if you're working with many layers and you want to make sure certain ones never move, you can go ahead and lock those off. And then here we have fill. Now fill and opacity work in similar ways, except one takes into account any effects that I have on top of my layer. So here you can see I've added a drop shadow to the layer. And if I take the opacity down, both the layer and the drop shadow go to 0. But if I take the fill down, you can see my drop shadow is still there, but the layers, the fill of the layer has been set to 0. Okay, so that's that. Next thing I want to show you here is you can see on the left here, you have your eyeball. This controls whether that layer is visible or not. And then on the right here, you can see I have a little link icon. This allows you to link certain layers together. So if I move one, I move all those layers. I'm going to do Command Z. To unlink, just click on the little link eyeball down here, or select all the ones you want to unlink and click on the link eyeball. Now none of those are linked anymore. If I move one, it's only going to move one. Another thing you should know is you can select multiple layers at the same time. If you want to select all these 4 layers, I would hold down Shift and click. Now I can move all those layers at the same time. If I wanted to select this one and this one, rather than holding Shift, I'm going to hold Command, and that'll allow me to select just those 2 layers. All right, next we have layer groups, and you can see that here. A layer group basically allows you to put 2 or more layers into a folder, and then you can just select the folder to move those elements at the same time. There's other things that you can do with folders in terms of organizing your composite and even creating visual effects. However, we'll get into those later. All right, next we have layer effects, and you can see that little icon here, the layer effects, and you can access those here. There's a whole bunch of effects that you can add to your layers. I'm not going to get into all those now, but you can get an idea of them just by reading here. You can add drop shadows, glows, overlays, and so forth to your layer, and they'll exist underneath the layer like this. All right, next I want to talk about smart filters. And this applies to layers which have this little icon next to them. What that icon means is that you have a smart object, which is kind of a layer embedded into your Photoshop file that you can make changes to, but which still retains its original in its memory. So here you can see this green butterfly. I'm going to do a transform by doing Command T. And I'm going to make this bigger, kind of rotate it, and then hit the check mark. You'll notice that when I hit the check mark, it applied this filter back to it, which is a hue saturation. So these work similar to layer effects. However, if I apply a filter to one of these smart objects, it applies it non-destructively. And non-destructive means I can always go back and change it. It hasn't made a permanent change to my pixels. So we'll understand a little bit more the importance of that as we start working in Photoshop, but just realize that's what that icon means, and that's what that little icon there means, that there are smart filters on that layer. Okay, last thing. So we discussed here the adding a layer effect. This adds a mask to a layer, and we're going to cover that in the next lesson because masking is super important in Photoshop and deserves its own lesson. All right, next we have adjustment layers. And adjustment layers allow you to add a layer to make a color correction or any adjustment to whether it's your curves, your exposure, your vibrance, your saturation, any of those things. And the advantage here is that rather than having to apply a correction to multiple layers, by adding it into your layer stack, so if I added it right up here, I can now make an adjustment to all my layers at one time. So that's the advantage of a layer adjustment, is it basically adjusts everything that's underneath it. So if I went here and made this a bunch darker and then change the position, you can see based on where this sits in the layer stack is what it's going to affect. So again, the importance of the layer stack cannot be undersold. The layer stack is how you adjust your image. So those are the adjustment layers. We can talk more about those. We will talk more about those as we work in Photoshop. All right, then here you have your folder. This allows you to group. So here you can see my folder. If I select multiple layers and click on the folder, it'll put all those inside a group. I'm going to Command Z that. The shortcut for putting stuff into a group is Command G, and that'll put everything into a group. If you want to change the name of the group, you can double click on it. New group. And to open and close the group, you're going to click on this little side icon here. All right, and then we have the new layer icon. If you click on that, you're going to get a new pixel layer. And then to throw it away, you're going to select the layer and click on the trash icon, or you can just take the layer and drag it to the trash icon. Another thing is you can make a copy of a layer by dragging it to your new layer icon. So here you can see my green butterfly. If I take that layer and drag it to the new layer icon, it's made another copy of the layer. Also, as you're moving a layer, if you hold down Option, it'll make another copy of that layer. So that's just something to know. Holding down Option will make a copy of your layer when you're moving it. All right, so that's your layers palette, kind of the basics of it. The next thing we're going to dive into is the masks and the importance of those. So we're not going to use this file for that, so we can go ahead and close this. I can click on this X to close the file, but we already learned the shortcut, which is Command W. And because we're not saving this file, we can do Command D. So there you have it. That is the layers palette in Photoshop. What we're going to cover next week is masking. So if you're interested in that, subscribe to my channel, turn on your notifications, and you'll see that coming up soon. Now, if you're interested in professional Photoshop training, check out Nucly.com. I sell professional training and resources for Photoshop, so you can check that out. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.